Should you roll over your employer-sponsored retirement plan to an IRA? Let's break it down on this episode of the Hawaii Retirement Show. All right, welcome everyone. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of the Hawaii Retirement Show. Today's episode, we're talking about whether or not it's a good idea to roll over your employer-sponsored retirement plan, such as a 401k, a TSP, 457, 403bs, plans like that, to an IRA. Okay, so there's a few things to consider. We'll kind of go through the pros and cons, if you will, the benefits and drawbacks of doing a rollover to an IRA. I think the best place to start is kind of understanding what we're talking about with employer-sponsored retirement plans. Most of us have them, right? 401k, TSP, 403b, the 457 Island Savings Plan, federal workers, right? The Thrift Savings Plan. And most of these have, the Roth or the pre-tax options within them. Maybe not all of them do. The custodians aren't required to offer that, but most of them have this Roth or pre-tax option. 401ks typically for private employers. 403bs, those are like your public school districts, churches, hospitals. I know our UH employees and Department of Ed have that 403b. And then I believe it's pretty much everybody across the state and city county system here in Hawaii has access to that 457, right? The Island Savings Plan, also known as a deferred compensation plan. Okay, and we'll talk about that a little bit. The TSP, Thrift Savings Plan, that's our federal one. And then you do have there is a couple like IRA-based employer plans, right? Your SEP IRA, Simplified Employee Pension. And that's usually for small employers. The SEP IRA, it cannot have employee contributions. It's only employer contributions. And these are set up, if you have a business and you set up a SEP IRA for your employees, then your employer contributes to it. The simple plan is a saving incentive match plan for employees. It's pretty similar to a SEP IRA, but you can have employee and employer contributions in there. Very different rules for those SEP IRA and simple plans. Just wanted to mention them. Definitely different contribution limits, and we're not going to get into the nuances of those plans here. But the IRA, right? Individual Retirement Arrangement. I think most of us are pretty familiar with IRAs. You have your traditional IRA, which is pre-tax, right? You get a tax deduction for the contributions you put in. And then we have your Roth, which is post-tax, right? You pay the taxes already. You put it in your Roth. You don't get the tax deferral, the tax deduction, but it grows both the contributions and the growth tax-free, right, in the future when you take those distributions. Whereas the traditional, you're going to pay ordinary income tax on all the distributions in the future in retirement. Okay, a couple key points here about, we're talking about whether or not it's a good idea to roll over employer-sponsored plans to IRAs. A couple key points to consider. You don't have to be retired to do a rollover, right? Let's say you work for an employer, you have a 401k, and you switch employers, right? And you're no longer, contributing to that plan. You're not necessarily retired, but you can do the rollover. You could do 401k to a new employer's 401k rollover, right? You can roll over between, different plans as well. And you can do in-service rollovers. Now, this all depends on your plan and the plan administrator and the rules around it. But you can actually do it depending if you meet certain criteria. Maybe there's age-based criteria, whatever it might be. You can do in-service rollovers as well. And just to touch on some key mechanics around the rollovers, okay? It's important to understand that there's a direct transfer, which is still a rollover, but it goes from custodian to custodian electronically, right, ACH. And then there's the 60-day rollover, where you're going to ask to roll over this money, right, from your 401k, and they're going to issue you a check. Once they issue that check, and once you receive it, have constructive receipt of that check, that's when the 60-day window starts, right? And you have 60 days to deposit it in full into the the new plan, the IRA or the new 401k. With that, there is a 20% withholdings, right? So they're going to withhold 20%. So they're going to give you a check for 80% of the distribution, but you're responsible to deposit the full 100% into the new, the new plan. That's why direct transfer is usually simpler. You do away with the checks, you do away with the holdings. It just goes custodian to custodian. If you have the option, I always recommend going that route. Okay, so let's talk about the advantages and benefits of why you might want to roll over the money from your employer-sponsored plan into an IRA. Okay, and we'll go through these. First off is streamline your finances. If you work several different jobs throughout your career, you might have several different 401ks. You can even have several different IRAs, right? And as we get older, I think it's always a good idea to simplify things, not just for yourself, but for your family. It's just easier to keep track of. The other part is RMDs, right? Fewer required minimum distributions to track. So this kind of goes in with the streamlined finances. Is required minimum distributions if you have pre-tax money, so not Roth accounts, but pre-tax in these 401ks or IRAs, eventually you reach an age where you're going to be required to take a distribution by the IRS because they want the taxes and revenue. And they say, well, you can't just defer this forever. You got to start taking money out and you're going to pay taxes on it. Now, you can aggregate IRAs, right? So if you have 4 IRAs, we can look at that as like one big pool, and we could take a distribution from one IRA that's large enough to satisfy the RMDs for the aggregated amount of your IRAs, right? With the 401ks, you got to take an RMD from each one, right? And so you can see if you have like 4 or 5, it can start to get a little convoluted. You got to calculate for each one or contact the custodian, figure it out, and make sure you're tracking this. And it can be a lot simpler if you just consolidate, roll things over into more of a streamlined, account portfolio, if you will. Okay, so we got to streamline the finances with the RMDs, tracking and managing those as a reason why it might be a good idea to kind of consolidate and roll over your employer-sponsored plan to an IRA. We also have the investment options could be a reason if you're not happy with the investment options in your current 401k, your TSP, whatever it might be. Oftentimes, IRAs have maybe a wider range of investment options within the plan, as well as, you can hold other things in an IRA. The only things you can't really hold is life insurance and collectibles, but you can hold other investment assets within your IRA. But as far as like the IRA, the individual stocks, the ETFs, mutual funds, you typically IRA custodians, you might have a wider range, but that's not always the case. And you might be perfectly happy with what you have. When you look at the TSP, right, you only have the 5 funds there. You have your life cycle funds and target funds, and then you got the G fund, the F fund, S fund, C fund, right, the I fund. And you could look at that and say, well, it's kind of limiting. But the other perspective is, well, it's kind of all you need also in some sense if you're just a simple passive investor. More investment options doesn't necessarily mean better, right? It's all just preference at that point. Okay, so potentially you could also have reduced fees and administrative costs within an IRA, right? Because with employer-sponsored retirement plans, there's a plan administrator and you're running this, and you're there's administrative costs with the plan. They're usually minimal, but a lot of times too, even the funds within an employer-sponsored retirement plan might be slightly higher, expense ratios for those funds, which, if you really want to squeeze all the juice you can out of your returns, every little percentage point of expense ratio kind of makes a big difference, especially when you're talking more money over a longer period of time. So not a big deal, but typically you're going to have some sort of administrative expense or fee with the plan. It might not be a lot, might not be a deal breaker, but something to keep in mind. Another reason why you might want to roll over to an IRA is to work with a financial advisor, right? If you're going to work with somebody specifically for retirement planning and you want that, that one-on-one trusted advisor who's going to kind of guide you through retirement, typically they need to manage assets. They're going to want to, so they can, oversee things and do what they need to do and charge their fees from that, right? So if you want to work with a financial advisor, typically you're going to roll over your employee-sponsored retirement plan to an IRA so you can work with them. Now, some 401k providers, they have like retirement plan advisors built in that can assist you. They might be limited in some aspects, maybe not. Maybe they can be a full service advisor to you, but if you're kind of limited to whoever is within that plan or whoever is managing that plan. Whereas if you want to work with a financial advisor, there's no shortage of them out there who'll be happy to work with you, right? And you can find somebody you like, somebody you trust, somebody you think is going to do the best by you, and you can work with them by rolling over your plan to an IRA, right? Okay, so last two on the advantages or benefits of rolling over your employee-sponsored retirement plan to an IRA is more control over tax withholdings and more flexible distribution options, okay? So when you take a distribution from your retirement plan, your 401k TSP, there's a required 20% withholdings from your retirement plan. Okay, and this is just built in. It's just the way it is. And there's also, depending on the plan, some other limitations as far as maybe state withholdings or however it might be, constructed. With the IRAs, you can really fine tune things. You can adjust how much withholdings more or less a little easier and get a little deeper into the control of your tax withholdings. And then same thing with flexible distribution options. These custodians, some of them are set up as kind of savings vehicles, not as distribution vehicles. And what I mean by that is they're great at kind of allowing you to manage your assets and accumulate within the plan. But then when it comes time to retire and maybe, the flexibility of withdrawal strategies can be limited by the custodian. They might say, well, we only allow for, this many distributions. This is the frequency, this is whatever it might be. It can be more limiting. And typically you'll find a lot more flexibility within an IRA for taking distributions. But that varies widely, so you got to check. All right, so let's turn our attention now to the disadvantages or drawbacks of doing this rollover into an IRA with your employer-sponsored retirement plan. So first one is circling back to those required minimum distributions. We mentioned how a benefit could be you don't have to track all the different required minimum distributions from these old retirement plans if you consolidate them right into an IRA. But if you're still working in your employer-sponsored plan, then you can delay required minimum distributions from that plan, right? As long as you're still working in it, you can delay it. Once you roll over that money into an IRA, even if you're still working, you're still subject to RMDs, right? Just because you're working doesn't absolve you from RMDs. So if you're still working for your company and participating in that company's retirement plan, you're not subject to RMDs just for that retirement plan. Any other retirement accounts still subject to RMDs. Okay, next disadvantage or drawback, and I think this is the biggest one, and it's definitely not a nothing burger. It's definitely something, but I don't think any of these advantages or disadvantages are necessarily, full stop deal breakers. It's just really important things to consider. So this one is the creditor protection. The differences between the creditor protection for IRAs and employer-sponsored retirement plans. Employer-sponsored retirement plans, they have protection under what's called ERISA, which is the Employee Retirement Income Security Act of 1974. And I'm not going to claim to be an expert on the legalities of bankruptcy and creditor protection. So definitely look into this yourself, but I'm going to give you my take on it of what I see. So essentially you got to look at, there's two parts, bankruptcy and creditor claims, right? Getting sued. Those are the two parts. So you're covered by bankruptcy and creditor claims under ERISA, right? So if you file bankruptcy, your 401k, your employer sponsored retirement plan is not subject to that bankruptcy. And then same thing with creditor claims. I guess you can be sued, but with the ERISA protection, your employer sponsored retirement plan, can't be touched if you're sued. Now, with that being said, let's say you roll your money into an IRA and you're worried about creditor protection. Most of us aren't going to get sued, right? I mean, it's an unlikely situation. If we are, it shouldn't be, millions and millions of dollars. But if you're worried about that, and even if you're not worried about it, it's a good option is to look into umbrella insurance, right? Just for liability. You get a small policy, or even a big policy. It doesn't cost very much, all in all, right? Shop around for it. But an umbrella policy, you can get, $2 million umbrella policy that covers you for general liability. And, that should take care of the creditor claims concern of ERISA protection. And also your homeowner's insurance policy has, again, I'm not an expert on this stuff, but I know it has some, liability insurance built into it. The bankruptcy stuff, obviously a consideration. Most of us probably statistically aren't going to cross that path. One thing to note is that, so let's say you have a 401k plan and you roll it over into your IRA. That amount, from what I understand, still keeps the bankruptcy protection just for that amount, not for any of the rest of your IRA, but the money you rolled it over. And again, I don't want to go too deep in here because I don't want to act like I'm an expert on the ERISA protection, the bankruptcy and creditor protection part of this, but it is a consideration. But also, even just your IRAs have some creditor protection as well, typically through some states. So again, definitely not a nothing burger, definitely something to consider. The ERISA protection is important, and it is kind of a big deal. There's ways to mitigate that risk through the the umbrella insurance for liability. And again, most of us aren't going to cross this path, right? I mean, most of us aren't going to get sued, and if we are, it's not going to be for millions and millions of dollars. Most of us statistically aren't going to go through bankruptcy. But yeah, it's definitely something to consider there. Okay, so let's go on to more of the disadvantages and drawbacks. One thing that I think is worth mentioning is, especially around the 457 Island Savings Plan here, is you might forfeit options to take early distributions penalty free. So we know the 59.5, right, 10% penalty for these retirement accounts, right? You can't take distributions if you're under 59.5, or you're subject to this 10% penalty, as well as any taxes that'll be owed on that distribution. Now, with the Island Savings Plan, 457, it's known as a deferred compensation plan. And once you separate from service from the 457 plan, and there are a couple of different kinds of 457 plans, the 457A, the 457B. But typically, deferred compensation plan, I know for the Island Savings Plan, when you separate from service, the 10% penalty doesn't apply, and you can start making withdrawals without that penalty. Now, still going to have tax implications, right? Especially if it's pre-tax, right? If it's Roth, then there's no tax implications there, right? But that 10% penalty doesn't apply. Now, another important thing to consider about the 457 Island Savings Plan, you can't roll IRA or other plan money into it, right? Because it has sort of these special rules and treatment. But you can roll your 457 Island Savings Plan out of it to an IRA or even to another 401k if that new custodian, that new 401k custodian is willing to accept it. The other caveat to this that applies to all employer-sponsored retirement plans is this the rule of 55, right? So again, going back to that, we're talking about 10% penalty, 59.5. If you retire, okay, if you leave your job, then at age 55 or older, you can start to take distributions from that retirement plan without the 10% penalty, right? This is the rule of 55, and the TSP abides by the rule of 55. So you can see here that with certain plans and certain situations, rule of 55 and then the 457, that if you just roll this money over into an IRA, you lose the ability to take early distributions penalty free. Now, most cases, again, this money is earmarked for retirement, and most people aren't going to need it before, retirement age in their 60s, right? But if you had to, that's available there. Okay, so moving on, you may lose the ability to efficiently execute a backdoor Roth IRA. So essentially, for those that don't know, a backdoor Roth IRA is essentially just a Roth conversion, right? So if you over a certain income threshold, your AGI, you don't qualify to make Roth IRA contributions, and you may not qualify to take the deduction from traditional IRA contributions, but you still can make non-deductible contributions to an IRA, even if you make $1 million a year. And what you do is you put it in this account, and through the back door, you have non-deductible contributions in this IRA, and then you do a conversion to a Roth IRA, and that's how you get in through the back door. Now, again, going back to, I mentioned earlier how RMDs are kind of aggregated amongst all your IRAs. So are conversions, right? So if you have pre-tax traditional contributions as well as non-deductible contributions, and you try to do a backdoor Roth IRA or a conversion, you can't just point out and say, well, I'm just converting this money from this IRA. The IRS is going to look at all of your IRAs, your pre-tax and non-deductible contributions, and they're going to pro rata, proportionally make the conversion. So some of that might be pre-tax, some of that might be non-deductible basis, right? So the best way to operate the backdoor Roth IRA is you don't have any pre-tax IRA funds, right? You just have, a Roth IRA, and then you have a sort of shell of a traditional IRA, pre-tax IRA that you would deposit into. That's all you have as far as pre-tax IRAs, and you put non-deductible contributions in there and you do the conversion. If you do this rollover from an employer-sponsored retirement plan and you have pre-tax funds that roll into an IRA, again, that's where you're going to have a mix of non-deductible basis contributions and pre-tax funds if you're executing this backdoor Roth strategy. Okay, another disadvantage is, you can't take loans, right? A lot of these TSPs and employer-sponsored retirement plans, they allow for loans. Typically not the best idea if you're saving this money for retirement, but sometimes you need it for whatever it might be. There are no loans from IRAs, right? And last one, which I'm not going to go deep into, would be net unrealized appreciation, NUA, and that's if you have company stock in your 401k that's highly appreciated. There are some nuances there about, being able to pay capital gains tax and instead of ordinary income tax if you do a rollover to a brokerage account of that company stock. I'm not going to go into the weeds there, but NUA is another consideration. Okay, so I think we talked about mostly everything as far as the advantages and disadvantages to doing these rollovers. Like I said, I don't think anything is a deal breaker. There's definitely some important caveats to think about. You kind of have to assess for yourself your individual financial goals, your situation, consult with a financial advisor or tax professional, or just dig in and do your own research, right? Nothing wrong with doing it yourself. And the really important thing to walk away from is you got to understand a lot of your plan specific rules, right? Like I got into with the 457s, right? Or you got to understand, does my custodian allow me to roll in, other funds into this new 401k or whatever it might be, or how does my plan custodian allow me to, manage distributions and taxes, right? So look into your plan specific rules. And then just, weigh your options carefully. And either way, you're not going to make a bad decision. It's just some things to consider there. All right. I think that wraps it up. If there's anything in particular you'd like me to talk about on the show going forward, email it over to aloha@hawaiiretirementshow.com, and I'll catch you all in the next one.
The opinions and statements presented on this show are for general information only and are not intended to provide specific advice or recommendations. Never make any investment or financial decisions based on information offered on this show without first consulting your financial, legal, or tax advisor. All economic and performance information mentioned on the show is historical in nature and is not indicative of any future results. All indices mentioned on this show are unmanaged and cannot be invested in directly. All information is believed to be from reliable sources. However, we make no representation as to its completeness or accuracy. Lastly, all opinions expressed by Jason Katita and any guests on the show are solely their own opinions and do not reflect the opinions of or are endorsed by ToBA Financial. For Jason Katita, investment advisory services are offered through ToBA Financial LLC, a registered investment advisor offering advisory services in the state of Hawaii and in other jurisdictions where exempt from registration.